This week we are reading most of René Descartes' Discourse on the method of rightly conducting one's reason and of seeking truth in the sciences, otherwise known as the Discourse on Method, published in 1637. This is a book that has a fair claim to being the origin of modern science. It's also the first place that Descartes expounds his famous principle, I think, therefore I am. While it is short, it is complex and fairly difficult to read. A good way to read a difficult book is to read it through once quickly before going back to reread it more carefully. This first overview gives you a sense of the whole that can then shed light on the particulars when you read it a second time. Some of the big things that we first notice are that the discourse is broken into 6 parts, and that in general it suggests a new method for studying the world. I am going in this video to summarize each of the 6 parts of the text. In part 1, Descartes describes his disappointment with his own formal education and the state of education and science in general in his day. He had been a diligent student in excellent schools, and still, mostly what his education left him with was unanswered questions. We all have the potential for full reason, he argues, so something must be inadequate about the way we've been going about finding knowledge. Quote, "That is why, as soon as age permitted me to emerge from the supervision of my teachers, I completely abandoned the study of letters, and resolving to search for no knowledge other than what could be found within myself, or else in the great book of the world, I spent the rest of my youth traveling, seeing courts and armies, mingling with people of diverse temperaments and circumstances." That's from page 5. Descartes seems to want the kind of certainty and systematic unity of science that only mathematics had come close to. Everything else, he believes, builds on shaky foundations. The great lesson he derived from his experience was, quote, "not to believe anything too firmly, of which I had been persuaded only by example and custom." Part 2 begins with his turning from the book of the world toward studying himself, his own mind. One day, when he was in Germany, involved in a set of religious wars that lasted 30 years, he shut himself up in a stove-heated room and began his study. He says that when he thought about the state of science, he noticed that many people had contributed to it from many different points of view, and it was a mess. He considered that buildings designed by many people were not as beautiful as those designed by a single individual. Maybe it would be best to tear down the house of science that his education had built in his mind, to cast out all the wrong opinions and begin again. He decided to make this new beginning. At this point, he says, this new beginning is just for himself, not for everyone or all science, although at the end of the book he suggests that everyone might profit if we all adopted it. He decided that what he needed was a method, quote, "for arriving at the knowledge of everything of which my mind would be capable." He says that on page 10. Inspired by logic and mathematics, he developed 4 rules to guide all his researches. And I'll just quote from page 11. "The first was never to accept anything as true that I did not plainly know to be such, that is to say, carefully to avoid hasty judgment and prejudice, and to include nothing more in my judgments than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and so distinctly that I had no occasion to call it into doubt. The second, to divide each of the difficulties I would examine into as many parts as possible, and as was required in order to solve them. The third, to conduct my thoughts in an orderly fashion, by commencing with those objects that are simplest and easiest to know, in order to ascend little by little, as by degrees, to the knowledge of the most composite things, and by supposing an order even among those things that do not naturally precede one another. And the last, in every case, to make enumeration so complete and reviews so general that I was assured of having omitted nothing. He goes on to describe how he applied these rules in his study of mathematics and invented a new way of solving problems, which we call analytical geometry. In part 3, which is not assigned, Descartes describes 3 moral rules he lives by provisionally until such a time as his method gives him a more perfect guide. Part 4 is a brief summary of the metaphysical foundations of his method, the way of thinking about how things are that corresponds to his kind of science. Just as he had earlier decided to throw out the opinions he received in school, here he tries to shed even his private opinions about even his most immediate experience of the world. All his sensory experience and all his thoughts he treats as, quote, no more true than the illusions of my dreams. That's on page 18. He goes on page 18 to say, quote, but immediately afterward I noticed that, while I wanted thus to think that everything was false, it necessarily had to be the case that I, who was thinking this, was something. And noticing that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so firm and so assured that all the most extravagant suppositions of the skeptics were incapable of shaking it, I judged that I could accept it without scruple as the first principle of the philosophy I was seeking. Then, examining with attention what I was, and seeing that I could pretend that I had no body, and that there was no world nor any place where I was, I could not pretend, on that account, that I did not exist at all, and that, on the contrary, from the fact that I thought of doubting the truth of other things, it followed very evidently, and very certainly, that I existed. The method of doubt, and the science founded upon it, cannot doubt reason, as it is based on reason. In part 4, Descartes also argues that the existence of God cannot be doubted. By reason there exists a God, and God guarantees that reason is not misguided. In the other section that was not assigned, part 5, Descartes suggests that we think about the physical world as if it were a great machine, as if it were a, quote, new world, somewhere in the imaginary spaces. We should consider the world as a machine of matter moving through space over time according to quantifiable laws, so that in principle we might tell the history of how anything and everything has come to be constructed. You might say he gives an account of how our science might recreate creation. Descartes begins the final section of his book, part 6, by alluding to the recent trial of Galileo in Italy for heresy, and how this discouraged him from publishing. Yet he believes that his duty to seek the common good of all men finally requires him to speak. On page 35, Descartes gives an explanation of why he thinks that his duty to aid mankind requires him to publish. For these notions made me see that it is possible to arrive at knowledge that would be very useful in life, and that in place of the speculative philosophy taught in the schools, it is possible to find a practical philosophy, by means of which, knowing the force and the actions of fire, water, air, the stars, the heavens, and all other bodies that surround us, just as distinctly as we know the various skills of our craftsmen, we might be able, in the same way, to use them for all the purposes for which they are appropriate, and thus render ourselves, as it were, masters and possessors of nature. This is desirable not only for the invention of an infinity of devices that would enable one to enjoy trouble-free the fruits of the earth and all the goods found there, but also principally for the maintenance of health, which unquestionably is the first good and the foundation of all other goods of this life. One could rid oneself of an infinity of maladies, as much of the body as of the mind, and even perhaps also the frailty of old age, if one had sufficient knowledge of their causes and of all the remedies that nature has provided us. In effect, Descartes is saying, my method has done big things already, but I need to do countless experiments according to it. He wants to show the utility that the public could gain from such knowledge, and he feels like this demonstration obliges all those who desire the general well-being of human beings, quote, both to communicate those experiments they have already performed and to assist me in the search for those that remain to be performed. And so we see that what Descartes puts forth as a story of his own intellectual development at the beginning of the book, by the end, seems to have transformed into a grand new social project of science that has ever, since Descartes, been one of the great forces in our world. So this pretty much concludes the overview of the book as a whole, and I hope that this will help you to make sense of all the particulars when you go back and do a closer reading of it. Thank you.